On today's World Insight with Tian Wei, China-U.S. trade negotiations have made important and periodic progress according to the Chinese side. Both sides agree to meet again in Washington next week. And the Chinese President Xi Jinping met top U.S. negotiators in Beijing and talked about a mutually beneficial and win-win agreement. Hello, I'm Tian Wei, and welcome to World Insight with me here live on CGTN in Beijing. We begin today's program with the latest in trade talks between China and the U.S. On Friday afternoon, Chinese President Xi Jinping met with U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer and the Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin, who were here for a new round of high-level trade consultations. Both sides said the talks yielded progress on important and challenging issues.
Handshakes after week-long talks. Chinese President Xi Jinping reiterated that ties between China and the U.S. was one of the most significant in the world. He said the two countries had common interests and they were both responsible for maintaining global peace and stability and driving growth. He emphasizes that the world wanted China and the U.S. to have healthy and stable relations. On trade disputes, President Xi said cooperation was the only way forward, but clarified that China would always stick to its principles. He hoped the meeting would lead to a deal which satisfied both sides. Mr. Lighthizer and Secretary Mnuchin extended their good wishes to the Chinese president and agreed that the bilateral ties were indeed very important. They say President Donald Trump had great respect for President Xi and he looked forward to maintaining close communication. The new round of high-level economic and trade consultation began Thursday morning in Beijing. After 2 days of talks, Secretary Mnuchin said in a tweet that the meetings were productive. With the 3-month trade truce set to expire on March the 1st, the two sides are scheduled for another round of talks next week in Washington.
For more on the latest China-U.S. trade talks, we have a very strong panel of 4 gentlemen joining us. In Beijing, we have Xiao Geng, professor at the Peking University HSBC Business School, and Xu Citao, the chief economist of Deloitte China. Welcome to both of you, sir, in Beijing. Also joining us in New York City, Robert Hormat, the vice chairman of the Kissinger Associates. Welcome, sir. Good to see you again. He's also the former Undersecretary of State for Economic, Business, and Agricultural Affairs in Bangkok, though originally coming from Washington, D.C. We have Steve Pruitt, a managing partner at Watts Partners. He was earlier with the U.S. House of Representatives. Welcome as well, Mr. Pruitt. Well, a lot to digest, I have to say, today, gentlemen, on this very important day, 6th round of trade talks between China and the United States. According to the news report coming out from China's official Xinhua news agency and CCTV, there are several things we need to dig in. One is that both sides agree this time that important and periodic progress have been made on so-called important and challenging issues. Mr. Hormat, to you, how should we understand that?
Well, I think it has 2 meanings. One, that they actually have made progress, but the interesting word is important and periodic. So that means that they have probably made progress on some issues, but perhaps not so much on others. I haven't really heard that terminology used in communiques before, but I suspect that's what it means. So while progress is made in key areas, there are probably periods of time during the negotiations when there was not so much progress. And actually, that's not surprising. These are difficult negotiations. They are challenging. There are a lot of very major issues that they're not just trade issues, but have to deal with technology issues, issues that relate to state enterprises, a whole range of other sets of issues that are much more difficult than the traditional kinds of trade issues to reach agreement on. And win-win, obviously, as President Xi has wisely pointed out, is a good way of looking at it, but it's hard to do in every area because some of them are very complicated, and what one country wants, another may not be able to provide.
Well, That's what negotiation is about, isn't it? If everybody wants the same thing and immediately agree on everything, that's not a negotiation, rather. And let's go to Mr. Pruitt.
Exactly, and one thing is they always go to the deadline. They never, almost never, in my experience, have they reached a conclusion right before the deadline, the day of the deadline. Perhaps even extending the deadline. That's when the really intense stuff gets going.
That's the art of negotiation, as you may know very well, Mr. Hormat. Mr. Pruitt, according to the news report put out by Xinhua news agency on Friday, after Chinese President Xi Jinping met with the U.S. top negotiators, there are several areas, according to the report, they had in-depth communication on topics meeting the two sides of the negotiators. Mutual concern, including technological transfer, intellectual property rights, non-tariff barriers, the service industry, agriculture, trade balance, and implementation mechanism, as well as issues on China's concerns. So there are a lot of issues actually touched on, according to this media report coming from Xinhua. The question really is, and it's a legitimate question, I guess, how much should be achieved with a negotiation of 2 days, in fact, when you have so many topics to be covered?
Well, in fact, I doubt that you can accomplish all of that in 2 days, and that's one of the reasons why these negotiations have kicked over again to next week back in Washington. Unfortunately, I suspect I would have to agree with Bob that March 1 is probably not the date that we need to focus on. What the President has always indicated is if they are making progress, that date could slide. I would be more than willing to bet today that date will indeed slide. There's just too many issues that are out there that go beyond what many of us believe were the initial start of this, which is a mathematical solution that need to be resolved and cannot be resolved very simply by 2 days of negotiations.
Right. And Mr. Xu, here in Beijing, that's why some say, so where is the goalpost? Well, for us, which is out of the negotiation, all of us are actually not insiders of the negotiation. That's how negotiators, good ones, are keeping their secret, right? They need to make sure it is within them, and therefore next stage of negotiation can take place smoothly. But given the fact that we know what we know right now, how should we understand the goalpost for next round, for example?
Well, first of all, I think so far I would say the development has been quite positive, because if we compare this round of negotiation with the previous one, I would say a lot more clarity has emerged.
Explain, please.
Well, because in the past, right, I think both parties were talking across each other. But this time, I think they stressed on mutually agreeable issues. We need to have some mechanism, and we need to check status quo. Periodically, I think that's a huge progress, right? So that means both parties now have a lot more incentive actually to clinch the deal. I would say that's quite positive. Now, what's the goalpost? I think, first of all, if we do not have this negotiation impasse, that's very good. So that's the first goalpost.
Right. So you see, people have been coming out with all kinds of scenarios, you know, what this round of negotiation will be and should be and would be about. The best scenario and the worst scenario. And obviously we're not having the worst scenario at all, because both sides have agreed in this very clear media report they are going to meet in Washington, and the date even is clear, next week. So Professor Xiao, how do you see where is the next stage according to what we have now?
Well, I think the next stage is most likely that the leaders of the two sides will continue to be involved, and the escalation of the frequency and also the level importance of the leaders' meetings and the phone calls or any statements.
Communications.
Yeah, communications is the key, because I see the negotiations as a process. The two sides are learning from each other, and the good news is that they have put almost all issues on the table, and then they also think there's a possibility for them to reach something which will be able to be delivered not far from now. I think that is really a good atmosphere, and that's more important for both leaders and also for the world, because too much pessimism, in the past.
Earlier, and also that is reflected in the stock market, for example.
Right. Yeah.
According to the Chinese media report coming from Xinhua News Agency and also CCTV, in which there's a paragraph suggesting that the American side has been expressing to the Chinese side, Mr. Pruitt, that President Trump, through the top negotiators, want to express to President Xi Jinping that he is expecting to continue to keep close communications with President Xi. Now, here's the question. Top diplomacy, that has been the practice we have seen between China and the United States when it comes to difficult and crucial issues. How will that likely also play a role for the near future as we are leading to March the 1st and probably beyond March the 1st? Mr. Pruitt.
Well, I'm actually encouraged by what we're seeing right now. There's an old adage in America that silence is golden, and the fact that they're not talking publicly and throwing rocks at each other as they did in previous rounds, I think is a very positive development here. As far as the process itself, I believe, unfortunately, that the negotiators are in a position where they need to be taking items off the table. As one of your gentlemen there in Beijing pointed out, everything has been placed on the table. But these negotiators really need to be taking things off the table so that by the time President Trump and President Xi meet, there really are only a couple of real mega issues, maybe no more than 5, that they need to sit down and look each other in the eye and agree to either agree on or disagree on and move forward. I suspect we're going to be seeing a lot of stagecraft going forward, a lot of promotion that suggested whatever these negotiations produce are a good deal for both parties, and at that point the analysis will begin. But I think silence is golden right now, and I'm encouraged by that.
All right, Mr. Xu?
Yeah, he has made a good point. From the U.S., well, the gentleman, the gentleman in Thailand, the United States, it's not a good idea to have a too lengthy laundry list because that's unrealistic in the short term. From China's side, I think concrete result need to be seen. For example, in the area of market access or better market access and liberalization of service sector. So if we can see progress on that front, I think the outcome would be quite favorable.
I know you are coming from the banking sector, so there might be different priorities for different sectors coming from both sides.
I'm not from banking sector.
All right. Okay then. Mr. Hormat, to you as well. How do you see that, the top diplomacy and the relationship between the top diplomacy and the field work that the two teams of negotiators have to do in order to pave ways for the top leaders to come to consensus at the end of the day?
Well, that's, of course, the big challenge. In any negotiation, the goal of the negotiators below the head of state level is to either reach agreement and don't announce it and let the heads of state announce it, or bring the two sides close enough together so that the final deal can be made between the heads of state. That's the way it works in a normal negotiation. Now, these are very technical negotiations, and I totally agree with the point of you can't get everything done all at once. So what you need to do is make progress or reach agreement on 2 or 3 very key issues, and then have those announced with a nice ribbon tied around it as a major win-win success for both sides, because that's what a negotiation in the end has to be. And then have a process that is established between the governments, the negotiators, monitored by the heads of state, to deal with those issues that can't be negotiated during this period of time. And I agree, the other speakers have said, you're not going to be able to get everything done all at once. It's very complicated. These are not normal trade negotiations. They involve a lot of other factors. And even in 2 days or 2 weeks or 2 months, it's hard to resolve all these issues. And some, there may be areas where governments simply can't reach agreement. In that case, you need a process for managing them or a process for resolving those differences over a period of time.
Right.
It took a lot of time to reach agreement on the terms for China's accession to the WTO. It didn't happen in a couple of months. It happened over a period of time. And that's the nature of these negotiations. Make agreements on key things, announce them as real progress, as real breakthroughs, but we can't do everything all at once. We need a process for dealing with those or managing those other issues.
Very important experiences to share, in fact, at this moment, what you just said, Mr. Hormat. Earlier, I also talked to the Chinese ambassador to the United States, Ambassador Cui Tiankai. He was with President Xi and President Trump during their December meeting. He shared his views about the ongoing trade talks between China and the United States. Of course, we need to brief our viewers. This interview was made in January. It's not necessarily about this round of trade talks, and yet some of the principles Ambassador Cui said during the interview also would apply right now. Let's listen in.
The assignment given by the two presidents to the two work teams is very clear. We have to develop a bilateral relationship centered on coordination, cooperation, and stability. And for economic and trade relations, we have to aim at mutual benefit and win-win outcome. So the goal is already set. Our task is to make progress toward that goal. And I still have confidence. I think that the two teams are committed to working together for that goal.
That's Ambassador Cui Tiankai talking to us earlier about some of the important principles likely to be implemented by both sides of the negotiating teams when it comes to different rounds of negotiations. Professor Xiao, you were listening attentively to what Mr. Ambassador had to say. And those words, of course, reappeared in the news report reflecting what the Chinese President Xi Jinping has been communicating with the top U.S. negotiators, this time when he was meeting them in Beijing. Professor.
Yes, I think of trade talks by definition is much easier to be win-win. The problem is that sometimes, particularly the U.S. side want to bring a lot of other issues, which is long-term reform, structural issues. And that, I think China is actually open-minded. But there are some limits, because it takes time. The two sides, the two countries have very different political systems, different culture, So maybe there will be some problems there. But otherwise, I see the trade negotiation actually as the easy part, because really the two sides have suffered already in the last year because of dispute. But now, there's a hope, win-win. Will emerge.
Mutually beneficial win-win, those have been the key words. It sounds abstract, but when it comes to negotiation on a day-to-day basis, these principles could be very important, bear in mind. Mr. Hormat, I want to still read a few words coming from this news report suggesting about the content of President Xi's meeting with the U.S. top negotiator. In the Chinese version, I'm translating very briefly right now into English, that the Chinese side would like to see to resolve the differences through the means of cooperation. And President Xi also said, so that both sides will be able to push forward toward a mutually acceptable agreement. He also said, though, of course, cooperation, there is certain principles that we would like to apply when it comes to the cooperation with the U.S. side. How would you, Mr. Hormat, given your very rich political experience in Washington, your close link to Mr. Kissinger, and also the knowledge of China, what exactly would that mean? How the U.S. side should understand this statement?
Well, I think he's making the point that Ambassador Cui Tiankai made earlier, which Ambassador Cui is very knowledgeable and really understands both the U.S. and the China situation. He articulated very well the views of China, and they're very much the same, of course they are, and very closely coordinated with President Xi, who is giving the instructions for the negotiators. And it's clear from what both gentlemen said, particularly President Xi very recently in the statement that the Chinese government is making, is that they want to reach some agreements in key areas. They want to have mutual cooperation. So he's saying, don't press us unilaterally. This should be done in a cooperative way and not a threatening way.
Right.
That's one point. And second, he's making the point that we have certain principles and we have certain processes and we have certain system that we are not going to compromise on in order to reach a deal. And the Chinese economy is run more by a state-oriented system. The American economy is a more market-oriented system. So he's saying the state is going to continue to play an important role in China. We're going to continue to support state enterprises. We have certain practices here that we'll not compromise on, but within that context, where we can reach agreement, we'll reach agreement. One area I think would be intellectual property, because I think China's come a long way in developing its own intellectual property. The U.S. has been pushing for intellectual property agreement for some time. I actually think it's potentially possible and indeed probable that some arrangements can be made to protect intellectual property, which serves Chinese interests and American interests, which will strengthen his goal of more innovation in China and enable Americans to come away with something saying we had more intellectual property protection. I think there are areas of convergence that don't interfere with fundamental Chinese principles or practices.
Beautifully said, and that takes the art of negotiation to bring really the common ground out, isn't it, Mr. Hormat? Let me go to you, Professor Xiao. Also, I want to read part from the news report suggesting what the U.S. has been saying, the U.S. top negotiators, to the Chinese president during their meeting. The U.S. side has been saying that we still see there are a lot of work to be done, but we still have hope. So you see that on some of the interesting, important, and certainly challenging issues, both sides seem to still hold on to the word hope and more work. Professor.
Yes, I think both sides realize that a deal is important for the economy of the two countries and for the world. But their disagreement about something which we talked before, the two systems are different.
Differences.
And I think in particular, the issues relating to national security, which has never been a problem in the last 40 years, and now is on the table. And that is not belonging to the trade negotiations. So I think there will be necessary to really separate those issues. Because that's a very important issue because for global peace.
Right.
But the trade is trade, and I think this is a point that both sides are learning how to deal with it.
This is a very interesting point you just raised. Mr. Xu, I also have want to have your insight here. That is, well, this is in the name of a trade talk, but we all know it is loaded with so many things, and therefore people are saying, how could it be possible that you will have a trade talk and loaded with all of these extra tasks that are belonging to other fields and talked in this trade talk format? Would that be possible to you, given what we have just heard? Your thoughts?
Well, trade talk itself is easy, right? Because the bilateral trade deficit imbalance, on the grand scheme of things, it's a relatively small issue.
Right. You see Mr. Liu He there already talking to President Trump, talking about buying of corns and things like that.
Yeah, that's
in order
easy.
to reduce
That's
the
the easy
deficit.
part. That's the easy part. So I think more difficult part, just as the gentleman in Washington, D.C. has alluded, for example, intellectual property right, that's one area. I think we're going to see convergence. Other area, I can give you many examples. China's long-term reform agenda actually is in line with many of the requests, but of course, timing issue.
Yeah, I could almost tell that the two American guests are also seeing the paramount tasks that the negotiators have when they are giving their long sigh also on air. I just heard it from Mr. Hormat. But before we let him speak, like Mr. Pruitt also to come in on this part. a negotiation loaded with a lot of tasks. Mr. Pui.
Again, as you noted, it's loaded with a lot of items, and many of those items, as I noted earlier, really need to be taken off the table and the focus narrowed to two trade issues that really move this thing towards mutual agreement.
All right.
I think when you start dealing with some of the other concerns that exist in the bilateral relationship, again, you're not going to solve everything through these negotiations. You probably don't have all the right players at the table at this time to solve many of those issues. And then the last point I'd make is that the processes of even implementing whatever agreement is reached have to be spelled out and understood by both parties. And I'm hopeful that we get more of that and more education coming forward to the American people, the Chinese people, so that there's an agreement on direction that we're trying to go in and what goals we ultimately are going to achieve from these negotiations. And I think at that point we can then crown these negotiations as successful and let the other parties who understand these many issues much better than those people who are negotiating right now go at those discussions on separate tracks.
Right. Mr. Hormack, before our break.
Well, I agree to a certain extent. I think that these people who are negotiating now really are not knowledgeable about a whole range of these other structural issues that we've talked about, intellectual property issues, issues that have to do with support for state enterprises. There are a wide range of issues that are not traditionally in the realm of trade negotiations. They involve a great many other things. But I think given where this negotiation is going, there has to be some progress on those other issues. Let's call them structural issues or long-term issues, because they're really the core of differences between the United States and China, not just the trade imbalance. That can be dealt with, as everyone else has indicated, with China buying more American goods. That can be worked out. These structural issues are more important in the long run in the relationship. And I think they can't take them all off the table. They've got to at least reach some agreement in principle or some agreement in practice on a couple of those issues, even if it's not fully laid out in detail.
All right.
And then have a process for negotiating or managing the others. And implementation is going to be very important. The U.S. has made a big point of having a monitoring device for ensuring that what is agreed is implemented. That may be difficult for China to do because I don't think China necessarily wants Americans going around investigating government agencies or state enterprises. So there are a lot of these issues that are going to be discussed, and perhaps agreement will be reached in principle or maybe even in some measure of detail, but implementation is going to be important, and you have to have a process over the medium term different from what we've had in the past for working out the other issues or at least managing them.
And of course, a negotiation takes two sides to tango. When one side is putting out the list, the other side is also having its own list as well. So how would both sides see eye to eye to one another on the list that both provide to the other side? That will be very interesting. Of course, another topic. Stay with us here on World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on our program. Chinese President Xi Jinping met top U.S. negotiators in Beijing and talked about a mutually beneficial win-win agreement. What is that about? It's up for a discussion. We're going to continue our discussion after this break. Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. After the latest round of China-U.S. trade talks, many wonder if or when President Xi and President Trump will meet again. But the two leaders exchanged last year in Argentina laid the foundation for current negotiations. In a sign of goodwill, President Xi Jinping from China received the U.S. delegation on Friday, mirroring President Trump's reception of the Chinese delegation in Washington last month. That goodwill was there 40 years ago, of course, between the two countries, when political leaders across the Pacific put aside their differences and opened diplomatic relations between China and the United States. Trade with the U.S. has swelled, along with China's reform and opening up. So did people-to-people exchanges as well in this relationship. So today, relations between China and the United States are seen as the most important one in the world. Will the world's two largest economies lift everyone up with them? Will they help bring global stability and peace? Can we see signs of it through this and the next rounds of trade negotiations? Still with us for this round of discussion, Xiaogeng once again, coming from Peking University HSBC Business School, and also Xu Sitao from Deloitte, China, in New York City, Robert Hormats, Vice Chairman of the Kissinger Associates, and last but not least, in Philadelphia, we are joined anew by Regina Abrami, I hope I pronounced your family name right, the Director of the Lauder Global Program and Senior Fellow in Management at Wharton School. Welcome to all of you. I want to invite our guest who is joining us anew. Professor, tell me about your thoughts. How much responsibilities China and the United States are shouldering right now, in fact, that they should reach a mutually beneficial and win-win agreement this time so that they will be working on their responsibilities for the rest of the world?
Well, there's no question that they need to be working on the agreement, and it does affect the rest of the world. I mean, a slowing down China obviously translates into less demand for goods from many other emerging markets, and likewise, a United States economy that is not well integrated with China means fundamentally having to reorder the structure of many supply chains, which likely will result in not just delays in production, but also potentially an increase in cost to consumers. The United States consumer has also benefited from a decades-long partnership with China, and if that trade relationship is not improved, it will for sure have important second-round effects. So it's not just about emerging markets and the developing world and the rest of the world needing these two huge economies to get along, but also so too do the Chinese and the American people.
Mm-hmm. Well said. Professor Xiao, also from the Chinese side, you know, it's been a while that for the business world to talk about geopolitics. But if you look at the discussion these days, economists like you are talking about, it's all about geopolitics rather than numbers.
Right.
So Professor Xiao, once again, how much responsibility do two countries and the negotiators have for the rest of the world?
Well, China is already a super, power in terms of the size, but with low productivity, still catching up in technology. So this is, but this shows the trend. The U.S. used to be so big, though all the other developing countries can be ignored. But now, no. So that's why I think for the global order, now is actually in transition. And the U.S. and China are representatives. One for advanced economy, one for emerging market economy. So how to deal with the future? This is a big question, and creates so much uncertainty, anxiety. Right. So that's why the negotiation is just a small part, but it reflects all the to be negotiated things in the future.
That's right. If geopolitics is so abstract for many people, the stock market is very concrete, I guess, when it comes to an issue. Mr. Xu, I know you are monitoring it every day as an economist. So what do you make of the U.S. stock market, the Chinese stock market, and the stock markets around the world in sentiment reacting to what's going on in the negotiations?
Well, sentiment is one thing, right? First of all, in the past few months, this is just a very crude estimate. The major development on U.S.-China trade talk could easily move both U.S. and the China stock market by 2% on a daily basis, right? So that's so-called the sentiment. But this is not just sentiment. If you look at the most recent decision taken by Federal Reserve on short-term interest rate, actually part of the decision was being made because Chinese economy. So a lot of China issues are increasingly global issues. That's not sentiment.
Right. Mr. Hormat, I know you work on geopolitics a lot, Before I go to you for your comments about this area, let's listen in to my earlier discussion with American political scientist Graham Allison, who caught the world's attention for coining the term Susie's trap. It refers to the situation when a rising power causes fear in another established power, which could escalate toward war. But according to him, both sides should really avoid that vicious cycle. Let's listen in.
Few big words. One is called New Cold War. Another one is called decoupling. Another one is called isolating. So the thought is somehow you could isolate China from the global economy.
Can you?
I think you can say those words, but China is a backbone of the global economy. China is the major trading partner of every American ally and friend in Asia. So basically, Thucydides explained to us how first you have the reality, then you have the perception and misperception, then you have the emotions, fear, and then that's combustible ingredients.
Build up upon each other.
So we should be saying, let's be calm, let's be clear-eyed, let's be realistic. It's not about blame, it's about resolving issues, because we're either going to live together successfully or we could die together. So if those are the two choices, that's pretty easy.
That's, of course, Professor Graham Allison, and, of course, Mr. Horma, you know his theories very well. Your reaction to his thoughts, and particularly on the issue that how U.S. and China geopolitically, through this round of trading negotiations, should show to the rest of the world that what they can achieve together.
Well, I think that's very important, that there should not be a confrontation between these two countries. There's going to be friction because there are two different systems. China is advancing in the area of high technology, advanced 21st century technology. The U.S. has always seen itself as the leaders in those technologies. Now there's competition for markets in those areas. But it shouldn't be confrontational confrontation. It should be cooperation within an agreed framework that allows China to advance technologically in 21st century technologies, and the U.S. to continue to do that. That has been done in the past. It can be done now. Mutual rise, and I would look at it this way. If the two sides can work together to create a better global economic order, as it's changing very rapidly now, we need to shape it in a way that deals with 21st century problems and deal with our issues. It's really mutually assured prosperity that is the end game if the two sides get it right and do the right things and work closely together. You won't achieve that through confrontation. You'll only achieve that through cooperation. And if you do, it's mutually assured prosperity for both sides, because they'll trade more, they'll invest more, they'll interact more in research and development, and it'll benefit the global economy as well, because as Graham pointed out, you can't isolate China. That notion of containment is ridiculous. China is, first of all, it's politically bad. It's a bad idea, and certainly economically impossible, because China, as Graham Allison points out, is the trading partner, the #1 trading partner with a great many countries, virtually every country in Asia, but also with many countries in Latin America and Africa. So you need to have this bilaterally constructive and multilaterally engaged.
Exactly. Professor Abrami, your thought about that, will the countries have the wisdom to be able to grow together and figure out a way together as a crucial juncture to avoid going in very divergent ways, so that the rest of the world also have to choose where they want to stand, which is going to be devastating?
Yeah, I don't think that a trade war serves either side, but at the same time, I think that the ideal of mutually assured prosperity is contingent on a number of conditions being met. And the issue right now is not about necessarily just selling more goods to China. And I think in your earlier portion of the program, a number of your panelists made clear that there were structural issues in play here. So while it is true that American businesses have benefited from access to the China market, such to the point that many products, more of them are sold in China today than they are sold in the United States. But having said that, that doesn't necessarily belie some of the problems that remain. So for mutually assured prosperity to come into being, I do think that some of those structural issues would need to be addressed. And for those to be addressed, I think both sides would need to take into account that they both need to give something for that to happen. And I don't know that we're there yet, because we're at a political moment in both contexts where each side needs a win for domestic reasons. And what that win's going to look like may not necessarily be able to be at least presented as win-win, because both, to some extent, need, even if President Xi has said that mutual gain and win-win is the goal, neither side, I think, at this stage and in this particular moment in time can say that they gave up something.
Right. You see, everybody has a lot of views to share at this critical moment. That really shows the importance of talking about. Professor Xiao, your thought, how will the two sides be able to approach it? We are leading to the next week.
Well,
very briefly, you got 30 seconds only, sir.
Yeah, I think less emphasis on the national security, all those concerns, but put more emphasis on people's happiness, people's living standards, and also global order. That will help the two sides really to get something useful and acceptable.
Okay, Mr. Xu as well.
For the U.S. side, I think it's important to de-emphasize the difference in terms of growth model. Not only has to do with the political system and also culture. In fact, culture is being less understood. For China, accelerating economic reform is the best response.
That's well said.
Thank you.
For now, I have to wrap up this round of discussion. When the negotiators are going next week for further negotiations, I'm sure, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to have different rounds of discussions as well. We hope to be able to have the chance to cheer for them once they resolve the issue through mutually beneficial and win-win agreements. For now, thank you so much for joining us. Robert Hormats, Regina Abrami, and Xu Sitao, Xiaogang. Really appreciate it. Have a great weekend, ladies and gentlemen. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insights CGTN into your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insights stage. And thanks for watching, and tune in again next week for more insights across China and around the world. The weekend is up. Have a good one, everyone. Bye for now.